we don't just compete with Chinese companies in China anymore. We compete with them everywhere in the world.
So good morning to everyone. Today we have the pleasure of welcoming Mr. Jacob Gunter of the EU Chamber of Commerce in China. So first of all, Mr. Gunter, thank you very much to take the opportunity for us to be able to interview you. Maybe if you could introduce yourself first a bit, and then maybe also already expand a bit, like working for the EUCCC, how you perceive EU-China relations, and especially, of course, in relation to trade and investments.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me on, Lynn. It's a pleasure to get to engage directly with some of our stakeholders in Brussels, and we've been fortunate enough to meet with EIAS quite a few times in the past. So yeah, hopefully this is of interest to the viewers. So my name is Jacob Gunter. If you can tell by my accent, I'm the American working for the European Chamber. But you know, until very recently, I was kind of an ideological refugee. So, but I'm the Senior Policy and Communications Manager here in the Beijing office. And so that means I head a lot of our publications and media and kind of high-level messaging. And I also do a bit of work on European affairs more than the Chinese side. So to your first question, sort of how we see EU-China relations moving forward, especially in the economic sense, I think it's the way that I like to describe it is that it's becoming more mature. In the past, China policy from the EU side, frankly, from a lot of countries, was almost exclusively economic in nature. There wasn't a whole lot of these other national security and you know, human rights and all these other concerns going on. And we think it's in many ways a positive thing that is maturing, because a naive relationship is not a sustainable relationship. So in that sense, you know, the fact that we're having these conversations now is positive. It can be a little rough around the edges, but that's overall a necessary thing to happen. And frankly, it allows us to have, you know, more productive conversations, because everyone knows that, you know, everyone means business. So, you know, we find more and more that as we have that more mature relationship, we have more productive conversations with our Chinese government interlocutors. And as far as the economic relationship goes, I mean, trade and investment remain very strong. China's a really important market for European companies. You know, every year we have our business confidence survey, and we ask our members, you know, are they considering relocating current or planned investments out of China? And you know, even if it's just some of that, only 11% of companies say they're even considering it, as of our 2020 business confidence survey results. And it just shows that even all these efforts to drive decoupling from different actors, and all the difficulties of doing business here and the difficulties of our increasingly mature relationship with China, it's still a critical market. It's still a critical place to be for growth, but also for innovation, for a lot of development and for competition. You can't be a global company if you're not in China. And so, again, I think that's part of that reflection on an increasingly mature relationship, but we should look at that and lean into it as a necessary transition and trend.
Okay, well, at the end of 2020, of course, last year, the EU and China actually concluded their negotiations on the Comprehensive Agreement on Investments. So to what extent will that be part of that maturing of this relationship, and what kind of impact will it have? What are the challenges, the benefits? Who will benefit the most as well?
Yeah. So, I mean, there are some pretty clear beneficiaries. Of course, assuming that it gets ratified, which is still an open question. It's a rather contentious issue. And, you know, as some of the key stakeholders in that debate, we're eager to see it ratified. It's not as much as what we had hoped for, but that's how negotiations work. You know, you're never going to get 100% of what would have been ideal for you. But what we see is that there are some meaningful increases in market access. There's going to be some new instruments and new ways to hold China to account to make sure that we have a level playing field. There are additional mechanisms being put in place to make sure that when there are disputes, that those can be resolved. and importantly, that they can be resolved state to state rather than company to state, because no company in their right mind would dare to try to sue the Chinese government and expect anything positive to come of that. So there are meaningful positive increases there. And, tangibly looking at something like market access, there are some improvements in access to cloud services and certain computer services that are really important, not just, as they traditionally would have been in the ICT sector, but as the digital economy expands across the entirety of, different industries, that becomes a horizontal issue. So it's really important to be able to get those kind of market access gains. And also, some of the level playing field benefits that we expect to see if it's ratified would be, guaranteeing equal access to licensing, which is a massive issue for European companies. About 15% of our members each year report running into direct market access barriers. That's negative lists and such for foreign investment. Twice as many, 30%, run into indirect barriers, and that's stuff like licensing. So making real positive steps there and then having these dispute resolutions, again, if ratified, which we think it should be, can really be meaningful and really help advance the interests of European companies that, again, I'll stress, they need to be here to be competitive. And if they're going to be, they need to have the best market access possible and the best level playing field as possible. And we think the CAI helps get us closer to that.
You mentioned that you would have liked to have seen even more in there. What would that have been? Or what more should be addressed afterwards then in that case?
Yeah, so I think certainly, there's still plenty of market access barriers, both direct and indirect, for a lot of sectors. You look at what China labels as value-added telecom services, of which cloud is one of them, and that's one of the areas where we did see some progress. Again, it's not 100% foreign ownership, but it's a step in the right direction. But within that, you have a lot of VPN services and online services data storage and management services that, again, are critically important across a horizontal slice of different industries. And it would have been good to see more of those barriers also removed. There's also a lot to be said about better access for a wide variety of different services and better access to, in terms of indirect barriers, to a lot of China's digital ecosystem. This is something we found in our decoupling report, is that there's a growing list of indirect barriers. And frankly, some of them are even, and I'm not sure they could be addressed necessarily through a bilateral investment treaty, but some of them are almost downright informal and more guidance from the government to potential business partners. So again, there could have been some significant steps in that regard. As well, more on competitive neutrality, on addressing SOE reform. There is some language in there about that. There are some dispute resolution mechanisms that might be meaningful for that. But until we see the current trend, which is that China's state-owned enterprises are, as President Xi calls for them to be, they're becoming better, stronger, and bigger. We see SOE reform has gone in the wrong direction in recent years. And until that trend really reverses, I think companies that have to compete with state-owned enterprises are going to assume that it's going to get worse before it gets better. So it would have been nice to have stronger language on that and stronger commitments from the Chinese side. But again, it's the nature of a negotiation is you get the best that you can, and then you go back to your stakeholders in Brussels and in member states and have to decide if that's enough.
And you already mentioned that the ratification process might be still filled up with hurdles. So what do you think that might actually pull them across the line and convince people that this agreement is a necessary step in the right direction? So how can we actually convince people of ratifying the member states at least to do so, to ratify the CAI?
Yeah, so the way I like to think about it is, a couple of years ago, the Commission came out with this communique on China, in which it labeled China as a partner and as a competitor and as a strategic or a systemic rival in different areas. And And again, that goes back to the maturity of the relationship that I mentioned before. And so the EU needs to build a comprehensive toolkit to achieve the different goals in these different aspects of the relationship. So on the partner and competitor side, something like the CAI is a really good development. It helps as a partner to help spur growth and investment and development, and especially right now at a time where the economy is somehow hanging on amidst everything with COVID. It'd be welcome to have a partner to help kind of spur a little bit of positivity in the markets through something like the CAI. As far as a competitor goes, like I said, you can't be a global company if you're not in China. And some of China's national champions are becoming so big and so competitive and so innovative that it's becoming difficult to compete with them in third markets, especially if they're kind of tied down by a lot of good competition law in the EU, which is good for a healthy market economy, but which Chinese companies are not beholden to very much. So it's important to be able to build scale in China and compete in their home market, to compete for market share so that they don't grow to such a scale that you can just never compete with them. So something like the CAI helps provide a stronger legal foundation for them to really to fight and compete in the China market against those competitors that they're increasingly facing off with in third markets and in the home market in the EU. So it really helps build the toolkit. But the thing is that a toolkit doesn't just have one tool. And that's where we see shortcomings in the CAI. That's where the EU needs to take more unilateral and autonomous measures. And we see some of those things coming out. Whether it's the international procurement instrument or different measures and mechanisms to deal with subsidies and coercion, to due diligence and human rights concerns. These are all the things that the EU should be advancing unilaterally to be part of this more comprehensive toolkit that will enhance, where possible, our partner relationship and our competitor relationship, and better manage the systemic rival side of the relationship.
Will it also address the negative trade balance that the EU has with China, or should other measures be taken to actually address this more?
Yeah, so the CAI probably won't do that much with trade. They didn't call it a bilateral investment treaty in its official title, but that's basically what it is. It's not a free trade agreement. It doesn't cover customs issues and trade flows and tariffs and tariff and non-tariff barriers and such. And it wasn't really meant to. It's meant to, again, provide that legal foundation that frankly didn't exist at the EU to China level for investors. If you're a European investor at the moment, you don't rely on, there is no EU-China legal foundation. You have to rely on your member state China legal foundation or on China's unilateral market access regime offerings. So again, it won't really do a whole lot for trade. Of course, more investment means more flows of certain goods. If you invest in more auto factories here in China, there's going to be more demand for certain auto components that companies are only willing to produce in the EU to be exported to China. So there might be some positive results in that aspect. But again, the CAI wasn't really meant to be a tool to deal with trade. Instead, we have things like the recently ratified agreement on geographical indications between the EU and China, which I know a lot of people may think of as kind of small potatoes. But if you're talking about protecting several billion euro worth of trade of high quality European products going into China, not only is that good news in general, but it's also good news to agriculture workers and farmers and winemakers and such. And these are important stakeholders within the EU. So whether or not a free trade agreement would be next after a CAI, we're not so optimistic on that. That might be a bridge too far, at least for the foreseeable future. But yeah, the CAI is a step in the right direction for investment, and hopefully more, perhaps smaller deals like this geographical indications agreement can help spur a bit more trade.
So I have several questions. The first one is, EU member states have different interests in the Chinese market. So how does the Chamber exactly harmonize this interest and project a single European voice in the Chinese market?
Yeah, so in many ways, we do that by not focusing on things by member state level, but focusing on an industry level. In fact, that's why the European Chamber was created to begin with. Back when Pascal Lamy was coming to Beijing to negotiate China's accession to the WTO, he got sick and tired of meeting with French industry and meeting with Dutch industry and meeting with Spanish industry. He said, I don't want to meet with national industrial groups. I want to meet with European automakers. I want to meet with European chemicals. I want to meet with European, auto components. And that's essentially where the European Chamber sprung from, starting with 51 members back in 2000. And so in many ways, because we don't look at things on a member state level, we inherently look at it just from an industry level. Which makes it a pretty valuable expression of the European project, I think. And frankly, you always have the advantage of having, an American like me who doesn't have any skin in the game on any of the member states. But no, I think we do a good job of that. And our executive committee is well represented of different member states. And we have a supervisory council that has one person from each of the member states that are meant to check us on this exact issue to make sure that we are representing industry interests, not member state interests.
Okay, I understand. And previously you mentioned a report that was published in January by the Chamber that was named Decoupling, Several Ties and Patchworks of Globalisation. I have several questions about this report because I think it was really interesting and important. The first one is, the report studies decoupling in 4 sectors, or main ones: macro, trade, innovation, and digital. Which of these sectors is decoupling more prominent?
Yeah. So to sum it up as simply as possible, it's not a trade war, it's not a financial war, it's a tech war. Okay. The digital side of things and access to critical inputs like semiconductors is where the most significant concerns for European companies are coming from. And it's really driving, China's self-reliance drive for its part, and the U.S. national security drive is essentially driving this tech divergence, in which if you want to be in China, you increasingly need to adopt, you either need to fully localize your supply chain as much as possible, or you need to find local suppliers for a lot of digital things. In order for it to be autonomous and controllable and reliable. And on the US side, you need to kind of purge more and more Chinese technology from your tech stack. And the direction that things are heading in is not promising for European companies that are accustomed to bringing American and Chinese and Japanese and European technologies all into their products or their services. It's going to be really difficult to bridge that growing gulf between the US and China's sort of tech divergence.
But in the report, it also argued that to reduce this gap between online environments, there would be basically we will need national and business involvement. So how can companies and governments increase their dialogue and with the Chinese government, I mean European ones with the Chinese ones, to basically harmonize online standards?
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of these things could be addressed more easily now than in the future. So, again, we see a growing divergence that's driving some real concerns. And part of that is going to be the need for, European governments, whether it's at the member state or the EU, to get a bit more involved. But frankly, a lot of it's also companies to need to get more involved in these things, especially on standard setting, because Chinese companies have really been showing up to international standard setting bodies with a united front, a lot of resources. And if European players continue to treat it as a purely technical discipline that they approach on an individual company level, then they're just going to be kind of outcompeted in these standard setting bodies by their Chinese competitors, and then have to abide by semi-politicized standards rather than strictly technical ones.
So basically on the report, it says that one of the industries, one of the European industries that China is not decoupling from, so basically stop investing in, is technology. Which industries is China in fact decoupling from?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think in many ways China is not so much decoupling from the EU and from Europe based on its own desire to. Part of it is, EU regulations and such are kind of pushing Chinese companies out of certain areas. Obviously, 5G is the most contentious issue on the face of it. And yeah, I mean, I'm sure that Huawei and ZTE would like to be more involved in 5G rollout in the EU, but essentially, national security concerns have kind of prevented that from happening or restricted it from happening as fully as they'd like to. And this is one of the big the key findings of our study is that where there are legitimate national security concerns, there needs to be regulation, there needs to be restrictions. The problem that we see is that it's no longer just on specific technologies; it's on entire value chains. So rather than just saying, this European ICT company, can't be doing this, providing these kinds of base stations, or can't be involved in information infrastructure in these specific kinds of projects, we're seeing that definition has kind of banned more broadly, and it's impacting the entire value chain. That's what's really going to drive a lot of damage in the economies, and it becomes self-defeating at a certain point.
That actually brings us also to the impact of the pandemic and on, especially also the aspect of global supply chains, as the pandemic, of course, has had some impact on, disruptions of delay of productions and other pandemic-related fluctuations in demand and supply. So to what extent have European companies in China or in Europe itself been affected by this? And has this actually increased mistrust among the partners? Or how can the EU and China together solve their potential supply chains disruptions and actually ensure global supply chains to be working?
Yeah. I mean, the supply chain disruption of COVID is obvious for anyone who's followed the news in the last year and a couple months. And the fact that it happened on this kind of rolling basis made it all the more disruptive. Where for a lot of kind of starting from the end of January all the way through kind of early to mid-March, Chinese companies were basically completely shut down and on lockdown. And that disrupted what was happening in the EU. And then later, as China was kind of getting back up on its feet, the EU and the United States and Japan, they were all kind of going down. And that really disrupted a lot of things, because if you're an automaker, for example, and even if you've localized 90% of your supply chain into China, if you're still relying on that 10% to be coming from European producers, if there's a disruption to that, then that's your bottleneck. It doesn't matter that the other 90% of it is going, because if you're missing, your crankshafts or your, a braking system, or there aren't that many components that go into an automobile that aren't essential, and you can't have a 99% complete car rolling off of an assembly line.
I would prefer not, no.
Yeah. So these kinds of disruptions, I think, really drove the point home that a lot of companies need to further increase reliance rather than just efficiency in their supply chains. The obvious problem with some of that is that a lot of the components that are still being produced in Europe and exported to China for final assembly are the things that they don't want to have IP leak happen. They don't want to run the risk of technology transfer being forced or of IP theft being made more easily by producing it locally. And so, companies are having to make really difficult decisions with that moving forward. And then lastly, I think we all saw at the end of 2020, and we're still seeing now, and it's growing, is the semiconductor shortage in the auto sector that is absolutely ravaging the entire industry. It's costing hundreds of thousands of cars that could have been produced, were ready to be produced, and were in demand in China to not have been produced because they were missing certain key semiconductors. And again, a lot of that was a supply issue that was kind of market-driven and driven by COVID concerns. But part of it, frankly, was a decoupling issue. It was that a lot of Chinese companies were trying to stockpile certain semiconductors, to try to mitigate against possible disruptions from American or European suppliers for political reasons. So there's a lot of resilience talk going around in Beijing and in Shanghai these days. What it will amount to is still an open question. And what exactly the EU and China can do to deal with that is also an open question, because frankly, the Chinese government, and we're about to see it with the new 5-year plan and the new 2 sessions meeting that's happening this week. The self-reliance push is accelerating; it's not slowing down, and that might make it less and less palatable for European partners to try to find common solutions to get around these issues.
So, Mr. Gunter, taking into consideration all the effects of the pandemic in all these sectors and industries, which sectors do you see as the safest for European companies to invest in China? And how can we attract more European investments in China?
Yeah, so in our decoupling report, we break companies down into one of 3 categories, which is they're either in business class, economy class, or they're in the cargo hold about to be kicked out the back of the plane midair. And the ones that are in business class, they tend to be in areas where China really needs certain technologies. And not just certain technologies for an individual industry, but things that are further upstream in the supply chain that will trickle down and affect a multitude of different sectors. So the chemical industry is such a good example of this, where Chinese chemical producers are just lagging behind on certain technologies. And that means they can't produce certain chemicals that are essential for climbing the value chain of a whole multitude of different manufacturing sectors. That without access to those, they just can't be produced. Certain things just can't be produced to a certain quality. And historically, as Chinese companies have started to reach that level in the value chain, they've needed to start importing these because European and American chemical companies didn't want to invest as 50-50 partners. And what we've seen is in the last few years, China has allowed 100% foreign ownership of some really, really major cutting edge chemical investment. And again, that's part of China's self-reliance push. Self-reliance doesn't mean getting rid of all the foreign companies. It means building capacity within the country to be able to maintain China's development direction. So if you're a chemical company, if you're a machinery company, Chinese companies can't build the machinery necessary to upgrade their own manufacturing in a lot of areas. So they need European engineering, which is often the best in the world, to literally build the machines that will run their factories. And of course, if you're in the semiconductor sector, I'm sure the Chinese government would love to welcome you with open arms to produce here, because that's another bottleneck to climbing up the value chain. Of course, that seems unlikely, not only because I think cutting-edge semiconductor companies aren't willing to bring their technology to China, again, for tech leakage and forced technology transfer concerns, but frankly, a lot of governments are putting export restrictions and are putting restrictions on selling or investing certain things into China. So in certain areas where China would really like to welcome that, they're just not going to be able to.
Mr. Gunter, we're reaching the end of the interview, so I'm going to ask my final question. How has Brexit affected trade relationships between the EU and China, and did it have any sectorial impact?
Yeah, it's hard to say because first off, it's hard to see what kind of negative trends are due to the times that we live in as compared to due to something like Brexit. It's difficult to kind of break these things apart. In general, there hasn't seemed to be any significant impact from what we've seen. And again, we mainly cover investment rather than trade. So I can't speak with a whole lot of expertise about how that's impacted the trading relationship. But the investment relationship has tended to be fine. I mean, frankly, I would expect that moving forward, we'll see a similar non-impact as what we saw on American companies in China during the height of the US-China trade war. Much to our surprise, and pleasantly so, we did not see that our American business partners and friends here in China were being negatively impacted or mistreated or being abandoned by their Chinese business partners or left out in the cold by the Chinese government. I think the Chinese government is very practical in the sense of, if you've invested in China, you're providing jobs, you're paying taxes, and you're contributing to economic development, and they don't want to start scaring away investors. It may be different on the trade front, but I would expect that there will be a similar non-impact between British companies in China versus European companies versus American companies here. I don't think the government really cares that much if you're British or European or Canadian or Australian. You're all foreign. They're more likely to treat you. You'll be treated differently than local companies, but they're not really making huge differentiations very often between your nationality. At least not unless there's some sort of geopolitical thing that gets crossed, like happened with Japan a decade ago or South Korea a few years ago. Then that might change. But thus far, we haven't really seen a major impact from Brexit.
But well, China is stepping up as a global market player as well. So how can the EU actually defend its own interests and its its own trade and investment opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of things it can do. Again, going back to that mature relationship, something like the CAI is a good step to work on. But frankly, pushing something like the International Procurement Instrument is something that we have recommended for years now as the representatives of European business in China, because European companies are routinely blocked out of public procurement bids in this country through a variety of different tools. And so the International Procurement Instrument that's been proposed by the Commission seems like a good way to provide a little bit of negative reciprocity, or at least the threat of it, in order to try to get some positive reciprocity in their relationship. And if nothing else, to even things out in terms of the ability to seize market share in procurement markets between our two economies. We also think, of course, reinvigorating the multilateral systems like the WTO is really important, and hopefully the transatlantic relationship will facilitate that a bit more easily than it would have been in the last 4 years. But also, one thing that we increasingly call on the Commission and on member state governments to do is to start really enforcing our bilateral investment treaties with third markets in regards to Chinese companies, whether it's through the BRI or just, frankly, the dominant position that a lot of Chinese SOEs can exert, and a lot of the diplomatic influence they can exert in third markets, especially in developing ones. We increasingly find that European companies are being disadvantaged in favor of Chinese, mostly state-owned companies in Egypt, in Turkey, in Central Asia, in parts of Africa. And these are areas where the EU can really fight for European business interests to say, we have an investment treaty with a lot of these countries. And that investment treaty was initially made to make sure that European companies were treated equally to local companies. But there's really no reason why we can't also apply those to, Chinese companies, or if it was American companies doing the same thing, that we could do that, or if it was Indian or Japanese companies. So really starting to enforce a lot of those in third markets, because, again, we don't just compete with Chinese companies in China anymore. We compete with them everywhere in the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, that is a very strong message, and I think we'll leave it at that, as it means that there's also a lot of work still to be done. So I'm sure that this is going to be an ongoing discussion and debate for at least another couple of years. So at this point, we would really like to thank you for taking the time to have this interview with us. And well, we will be following up on your work, and well, we look forward to cooperating even more in the future. So thank you very much.
Thanks for hosting me, and hopefully we get to do our annual EU tour to Brussels again, and we get to meet face to face soon.
Looking forward to that for sure.